Okay, so this is a classic video that I've shown several times. Now, ostensibly, this is an experiment. I wouldn't classify this as a uh, technical scientific experiment, but it's kind of in the experimental design, where the demonstration is basically showing you the effects of culture on our everyday lives.
The hamburger is a culinary culture, and it's actually an American phenomenon. It's been very interesting to see their reaction to the hamburger because they've never seen such a foreign piece of food before, and they didn't even quite know how to pick it up, and they didn't know how to, from what end to eat it.
Well, what we're doing is really talking to people who have absolutely no awareness of either Burger King or McDonald's advertising and have never experienced a hamburger. Typically very difficult people to find, and it would be impossible to find them in the United States.
You can never really get an entirely pure taste test from a group of Americans because they've been exposed to so much advertising, the burger culture, those type of things for such a long time.
You're going to go all around the world and find people that are really off the grid, who perhaps don't have televisions, who don't have access to, restaurants and whatnot, who really live outside of things. And you're going to see how they feel about a taste test between the Whopper and the Big Mac.
My role is to really make sure that the taste test portion adheres to strict claim substantiation rules and manner in which the research is conducted. We needed to do the taste test close enough to the store so that by the time the product was purchased, they could be eaten within 15 minutes.
I mean, this is a big experiment. We're documenting it, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Thank you for agreeing to take part in our product test. We will ask for your opinion on two hamburgers that you will be tasting today.
It was really interesting. We were able to see these people's first bite of a hamburger.
With my hand or with a knife?
They'd come in underneath and do the one-hander, and they'd look at it. And it took them a while to understand the dynamics of it. And so that was fascinating to see because we take it for granted because we live in America where hamburgers are consumed, like a staple.
When we see like this pose right here, the reason that they are approaching the hamburger in this way is due to the fact that they have no cultural experience with hamburgers. These are indigenous people from various parts of the world that are largely removed from the Americanized world culture that involves fast food commodities. So the hamburger is a fast food commodity that was developed over the 20th century. And because of our exposure to this culture, we learn the norms of consuming hamburgers. These people have never learned the norms, have been socialized into the normative culture of consuming hamburgers. So when they look at it as like this person. What is it? Like, why is there bread on top of vegetables that is on top of a meat patty? And you have to understand that when in this video they're talking about Americans, we can really talk about Americanization, the spread of American culture that was due to the growing supremacy of the economic, political, and military powers of the United States after World War II. So corporations that developed in the United States had an advantage where they could have access to a large consumer base in the United States, and then they pursued world markets across the globe. Over time, there were populations that were largely unaffected or unreached by these corporations. And so they would never have experienced the marketing where you see a commercial of somebody grabbing a hamburger with the thumb underneath. Like this is very typical. Now, I think, in my opinion, I think that since the large part of the bun is on top, that you should really go underneath and pull the large part of the bun over, because then that gives it more area to soak up any of the juices or the condiments that are on it, as opposed to the bottom of the bun, which tends to be thinner and flatter. That like gets soggy faster. Of course, that doesn't matter if you eat it fast enough. But the reason that they're approaching it in this way is because they've never seen one before. They don't know what it is. And it can be kind of astonishing to think about this because, well, I mean, isn't it so obvious? But that's the entire point of this phrase that I wanted to point out, where the narrator says, we take it for granted that hamburgers are, you know, in a thing in our existence. And it's this idea of taking for granted our culture that I wanted to highlight with this video, because like the old saying goes, culture to humans is like water to a fish. Like fish are designed, or they evolved to live in water with their physiology, their biology, their chemistry, their entire makeup is suited to live in water. Culture is the same thing for human beings. We are cultural beings. We are social beings. There's multiple reasons for this, and there's multiple ways that I could explain this. But one way to think about it is that we have natural language centers in our brain that develop naturally for the purpose of communication. Communication is a necessary ingredient in culture. If we couldn't communicate with each other, there would be no ability to transmit information that we have in our minds to other people. We would just be kind of like random chaotic beings with no ability to infer the mentality or to deduce the ideas or intentions or motivations that other people have. But more than that, we wouldn't be able to spread information about clothing design, architectural design, cuisine design, or the design of our social and cultural environment around us that we're always already born into as social beings suited for the acquisition of culture. And then we become socialized into culture, and then we reproduce that culture between each other. And that's how that works. I mean, there's a lot more to be said about it, but the purpose of this video is to show you that there are people who are so unfamiliar with our Western Americanized way of life that when they see a hamburger, they're like, I don't know what this is. Do I take the bun off the top and separate it out? And they're kind of like looking at other people for information on how to approach this thing, because they're like, I don't know. The people in this video represent various societies with their various cultural norms and values. But one thing that they lack, or one thing that they have in common, is ignorance of a dominant world cultural norm, which is eating hamburgers. Something as simple and mundane as that. So I'll play a little bit more of the video so you can kind of get a sense of what's going on. And then I'll jump into some of the textbook material.
People seem to really like the Whopper, so going back to their villages and sharing things about both of our cultures is something that we want to do.
We're going to be making food for people who have never seen hamburgers before, and we're going to see what they think.
How are we cooking for them?
Well, Anthony somehow arranged to get a real-life Burger King broiler, custom-made somehow, to go portable. And we just asked a lot of them where they're, have they ever heard of a hamburger, and they have not. They've never seen a hamburger. They don't know what it is. I'm really curious to see their expressions.
Would you like to try a Whopper?
Sandwich American.
Like this. There you go. Would you like to take a bite of a Whopper American sandwich? No?
Try it.
Present cercați.
This is the number one obstacles we you know, like AC outlets, every country has a different AC outlet. Well, every country seems to have a different propane adapter outlet, and we're not being able to, we thought we had the correct outlet for this one, and we didn't. We had the good one for Thailand, but not here.
And that's kind of a metaphor for cultural differences. And again, there's quite a bit to be said about this, but I have condensed the material, as I always have to do for these semesters. We have, relative to American universities, we have 4 shorter weeks. We have 4 fewer weeks. So typically, like for most of my career, I'd been teaching for 18 weeks. And then at the University of the Bahamas, there's a different organizational culture in which we have 14 weeks. And so necessarily, I can't cover everything. I remember one of the comments I got back the first semester I taught, a student said, well, I didn't like the fact that you said we didn't have enough time to cover everything. And I'm like, but I literally don't have enough time to cover everything. Like, it's not something I did. If I tried to cover everything, we would have to go so fast through the material that then we couldn't cover anything in depth. So one of the things that I tried to do for this course is constantly revisit ideas I've been going over since the beginning of the semester, so that hopefully by the end of the semester, the ideas begin to settle in. So one of the ideas that I've been going over is this notion of the relationship between social structure and the individual. So you're an individual, I'm an individual, each of your parents are individuals, but think about it this way. If you have parents, that's a group of people. So your family is also a group of people. Now, if you think about like the nuclear family, that's a specific type of a group of people within a social institutional context. If you think about your extended kinship network that goes up to your grandparents, and you think about like your cousins and how you share grandparents with your cousins, but also you and your cousins have different grandparents. So they have a slightly different kinship network than you do. But we can extend out these networks into the rest of society that traverse institutional context. So you can think about the relationship between family and religion. You can think about the relationship between family and education and religion. Like think about a private, maybe Catholic school. You can also think about organizational networks that go beyond family, religion, education. And there are many, many organizational networks, but I'll get to that in a second. So social structure in the individual is an important sociological concept, because what it does is it helps us to systematically or methodically think about the contexts in which we live our everyday lives. And at the broadest scale, we have culture. So culture is the most pervasive element of society. And when we think about elements, we think about like the periodic table, that an element is something that exists that cannot be broken down into a more functional basic part. So like atoms have atomic particles, the electron, neutron, and proton, and then you break apart, I think it's the proton, and it goes down into quarks, and then you have like subatomic particles, yada, yada, yada. But the idea of saying that culture is the most pervasive element of society is saying that, well, if you think about society in terms of having component parts, like society is not just a bunch of people. Society has patterns to it. The broadest pattern is what we would call culture, which consists of the values and the norms, as well as beliefs and knowledge and artifacts, but the values and norms that form the ideational relationship between people. So values are what we consider to be important. They are our priorities. What do we prioritize? Do we prioritize leisure? Do we prioritize work and progress? Do we prioritize privacy, safety, security, economic well-being, social well-being? And I remember earlier this semester, one of our uh, one of our friends in the course kind of challenged me on this idea, but I would still just say, we'll just entertain the idea that there can be a contradiction between what you believe to be good, right, true, and fair, and then what we act upon. So there's sometimes value contradictions. Like one value contradiction might be the idea that you want to progress, you want to achieve, you want to move through life in a kind of steadily inclining pathway into economic success, into social success, into like a state of better mental health. But then if you think about like what some people, not I wouldn't say you, but I do it too. What some people do is like we procrastinate and we put things off, and we don't want to work on some things that are harder or kind of immediately satisfying. And then you get to a point where, okay, you need to achieve and you need to progress and you need to meet the benchmarks. Let's say like you have an assignment that's due and it's not something that you necessarily want to do. You'd rather be playing video games or watching reels on TikTok or spending time with your friends, or you have to go to work, or you have to complete other assignments that are, for your major program of study. And you have like these writing assignments for somebody like Dr. Ella Fritz, and, kind of seems like busy work and things like that. So sometimes what people will do is because they've prioritized achievement and success, and then we have to work within an institutional setting. So the institutional setting that we have that is guiding our relationship is education. Specifically, the organization of the University of the Bahamas gives me course objectives, a course syllabus, textbooks to teach from, and then I'm kind of like put into a position where, okay, I need to design a course that is meeting the institutional goals of education, of development, of critical thinking, and cognitive skills related to communication. So I've got to get my students to write. But, your priorities might be elsewhere. So you kind of set this stuff off. And then because we have another institution called technology, we have access to things like artificial intelligence that can make our jobs easier. Kind of like having a calculator. Like, why would you sit down and spend your time, adding and multiplying and dividing and doing the square root of some complex math when your calculator and a statistics program can do these things for you? Well, now AI has come along and it's advanced to the point where it can basically do an assignment for you. So as you know, and as you've heard me say before, I've designed the assignments in this course in such a way that it makes AI practically useless for the purposes of completing my assignments. So it's like I was discussing at the beginning of the semester. I know what students are doing and I know what's underlying it. There are cultural values of achievement and success, but there's also institutional and organizational opportunities to use more expedient routes to achieving the goals. So we can discuss that to no end, but I want to progress the conversation forward. So the idea is that we as individuals, uh, we have a biological makeup, we have psychological characteristics like emotional maturity, cognitive development, different aptitudes and skills and preferences and tastes. But as social beings, we have common experiences. One of the common experiences that we uh, almost all as human beings share is culture, the norms and values and beliefs and knowledge and attitudes and artifacts that pervade our lives. The point of the video that I showed you is that you you should consider the value of thinking about the cultural norms that guide your life, as in, like, what is what is a fact of your life that you did not choose but guides your behaviors? And I would say, well, part of that is the expectation that other people engender or socialize into us, that we develop ourselves as individuals. And now not everybody's doing this. I mean, believe it or not, most people don't go to college. And college is not the only pathway to success, but it's the institutionalized pathway that we consider to be legitimate in society. So when we break down society into its fundamental component parts, we think about culture as the prevailing sort of guiding ways that we talk, that we dress, that we eat, just the normal architectures. What side of the road do you drive on? How do you greet people? Then we have the institutional settings, and an institutional setting is composed of organizations, except when you talk about the family, because typically we don't have an organizational structure with the family. And then we have the groups of people that we interact with. So we are a secondary group. The reason that we come together and that we meet and that we talk to each other is because we have a purpose, we have a goal. And that goal is related to the organization, the University of the Bahamas, and the institution, education. So if we move on to chapter 9, and I reference the title of chapter 9, which is Organizations, Institutions, and Globalization, then we can start talking a little bit more specifically about some of these structures, like organizations and institutions. So there are organizational networks within institutions. Now think about this. Like if I pull up an image, the two obvious organizations that are networked together are McDonald's and Disney. So McDonald's and Disney are both profit-seeking organizations that, basically provide services for people, food, entertainment, but even deeper than that, like just a sense of nostalgia, a sense of joy and wonderment. And it's not just these two corporations, because you have to think about it. What organizations would have to be involved to produce the plastic products that these toys are made out of? So these are petroleum-based plastic products. So now you are involving organizations that drill for the oil. But if you think about it, well, if an organization is going to drill for the oil, they have to have the machinery necessary to drill for the oil. So there are fabrication and manufacturing organizations that produce the machinery, but in order to get that material, those organizations also rely upon other organizations that mine the raw materials, the iron and the other minerals that go into producing the base elements of the machinery. So just thinking about the relationship between Disney and McDonald's and these toys, all of a sudden we're dealing with the extraction of raw materials from the earth that are necessary to produce the machinery that's necessary to produce the base products to just produce these little plastic toys. Now go to McDonald's and think about just like a regular hamburger, right? It's got a bun, it's got lettuce and onions and tomato and pickle and the burger and the cheese and the ketchup and the mustard. Each one of those ingredients necessarily has dozens of organizations that are involved in developing the raw base material products, manufacturing, fabricating, and producing the ingredients that go into the ingredients that end up making the ingredients for the hamburger itself. So when we think about organizational networks within institutions, which is the topic here, really, if you just put a little bit of thought into it, you'll start to kind of understand the idea that there are so many functionally interrelated organizations that if there were a problem in any supply chain at any point in time, it's going to have ripple effects into the rest of the organizations. And yeah, I personally know somebody whose entire job it is to make sure, for example, that the supply chains in Walmart don't get interrupted, that every step of the way in the supply chains from the various manufacturing plants all around the world, that they end up putting stuff on the shelves of the stores that people go to and don't really spend too much more time thinking about than what the price is. And if you really think about like how much money that we spend on a meal at McDonald's or a piece of clothing or a gallon of gasoline, like it's kind of amazing to think that there are so many organizations that are involved in producing these end products that really we don't really spend that much money considering the amount of work and energy and time that went into not just producing, but also distributing, shelving, and monitoring those products. It's kind of amazing once you think about it. Now, there's another, I think, amazing thing that's going on, and it's this idea of institutional pressures towards similarity. So, because there is a cultural environment that is pervasive, because there are institutional settings like economic settings and political settings, military, religion, technology, arts, leisure, science, because of these settings, there are common experiences that people have. And if there's a successful way of doing something, like let's say, putting a bun on either side of meat and cheese and lettuce and pickled tomato, or maybe it's chicken or fish, or maybe it's fried chicken, or maybe it's like a pizza or tacos or spaghetti or some type of, product that people demand. There's going to be other organizations that see that and they say, aha, that's a successful way of earning a profit or earning a living. We should copy that. I mean, that's one very basic institutional pressure, is just the profit seeking motive. And so like the newest example that I have for you is scrolling social media, like the scrolling social media norm. Think about like how normal it is to have your phone out and you scroll. So if you use your thumb or if you use your finger, I don't know, if you've ever used your nose before or something weird like that, but how normal it is. And why do we do that? Well, because over time, uh, we found out that scrolling was something that people preferred, or it meant an expedient need. And then all of a sudden you see most of the major social media sites having a scrolling mechanism. It's an institutional pressure towards similarity, and it's based upon the design of our smart devices, our personal media devices. It's based upon uh, the way that the human mind interfaces with these personal media devices. But it's a part of the process of what's called isomorphism, and this is a part of uh, world culture. So if I did not clue you in on this, today's lecture is about world culture and global governance. And like the rest of the material post midterm exam, I have your reading list for you. I want to emphasize again, most of this is assigned in other places. So if this looks like a lot of reading, it's basically revisiting points that I've covered before. And so I'm just re-emphasizing the material that I believe that, could be of value in terms of developing your critical thinking and your knowledge base. So the relationship between uh, institutional pressures towards similarity in world culture can directly be seen in this reference right here, DiMaggio and Powell, 1983. It's the same reference that's used right here. So that's how I'm showing you that this is the same exact concept. So isomorphism is this idea that we've entered a new phase of humanity, where really for the first time in history, we have these global models of organizational life, of institutional life, and that we're being moved towards situations in which people all around the world have similar or common experiences. Now, there's a lot to be said about this, like with everything else. And this particular material can be very difficult because, again, this book is really designed for a more advanced course. However, at this point in time, I would hope that you'd be able to recognize what's going on here. Like when Ritzer says different domains, and then he references politics and business and education, family, religion, and so on, he's really talking about institutions. So these broad social contexts in which we live our everyday lives. Like you hardly ever live outside of an institutional context. There's always some component of family, religion, education, business or economics, politics or the state, military, science, technology, sports, leisure, gender, race are also social structures. And you can think, well, wait, gender and race are part of our like identity. It's well, yeah, but you're also a son or a daughter, you're also a consumer, you're also a taxpayer, a citizen, a civilian. We have these other institutional identities. And so these are very pervasive elements of society. The most pervasive element would be culture. Right now, we're moving into a situation in which a world culture is possible because of the institutional pressures towards similarity. So, in this way, we can start to break down societies individually into their component parts, but we can also start to analyze the interactions or the interrelationships or the interdependency or the integration of societies around the world, which is a very structural functionalist way of thinking about things. We're just thinking about the structures of societies and the functions or their purposes, what they do. So if we wanted to, we could also introduce ideas about inequality, power, domination, oppression, marginalization. And in that way, we would be shifting our mindset over to the conflict perspective. So in this way, I've been trying to teach you a systematic way to think about the world around you. You can think about the structure or components of societies, what they do, so the structures and functions, as well as you can enter into it the problems that evolve. So if you do that, you can more systematically and rigorously think about the world around you. That's one of the points of taking a general education course like this. I can't do much in the way of practical skills and utilities that will directly pay off, but sociologists believe that there is a value in being able to intentionally use your brain to start to break down the social world into what it is and what it does. Isomorphism is a concept that you can use to think about the world around you. Like if you think about just eating hamburgers, I mean, like something as stupid and mundane as eating a hamburger, and what does that have to do with anything? Well, believe it or not, but there are some people in the world who don't know how to eat a hamburger. And did you see some people in that video who were like, "Yeah, I don't want to, I don't want to try it," because when they look at it, it looks like a foreign object. It looks like something that like I don't even know what that is. Like, why would you have bread surrounding meat and vegetables? That doesn't look appetizing to me. For a lot of people, hamburgers look completely appetizing. And then there are like people who are like vegetarians and vegans who, would prefer like a tofu burger. And believe it or not, but there are places where McDonald's has to change its menu to meet the cultural norm of vegetarianism, like throughout India, where there are dominant religious or institutional beliefs that lead people to the norm of not consuming beef. And so if McDonald's wants to make money in India, then they have to change their ingredients in their menu to meet the local culture. That's where you get into an idea about cultural hybridization, in which you have this intermixing of global forces with local forces. But right now, I want to focus a little bit more on this idea of world culture. Now, I don't particularly think that this definition is that helpful because, like, think about this. World culture involves the spread of global models leading to global convergence. And I'm like, well, yeah. Okay, so but then what is world culture? Because I would think if you talk about world culture, it would be like uh the global norms and values that are shared across the planet. That would be a better definition according to me, but Ritzer is like, oh, it's the spread of global models. Well, I'm like, well, what's a global model? And then he says, oh, well, isomorphism is a series of global models. But I'm still like, okay, but what is a global model? Like, tell us what this thing is. So he talks about the models of various structures in society. Now, I hope that at this point in the semester, you kind of understand what I mean. If I say structures of society, institutions, organizations, and groups. And then you can talk about different types of groups, different types of organizations and organizational networks. You can talk about pressures towards similarity among organizations due to institutional contexts. And then you can talk about different levels of society as well. So I will leave it up to you to read through the rest of this material because at this point I want to push the conversation forward. My hope is that you will read this material. If you're just looking for the boldface terms and some of the section headings, I think you're doing a better job than most. But I want you to push yourself to excel. And I do believe if you spend time with the reading material that I've given you, that you can begin to get something out of it. But the second part of this lecture deals with global governance. So, as I pointed out several times this semester, Newman does something funny where he talks about globalization in terms of the increasingly interrelatedness of people's lives all around the world in terms of economics, politics, culture, and the environment. See Chapter 9 for more detail. Then when he gets to globalization and social institution, he spends gobs of time on economics. I mean, look how many paragraphs are dedicated to economics. Then he talks about education. Then he talks about religion, but he doesn't talk about politics. I find it kind of strange. Let's think about education as a global model. Like if Ritzer is going to talk about world culture in terms of increasing isomorphism, increasing institutional pressures towards similarity. And he talks about world culture is the spread of global models that are isomorphic. What is he talking about? Okay, let me give an example. If you've ever taken a standardized test before, you've participated in world culture. So standardized tests are an isomorphic structure within the educational system. Standardized tests are used because they are effective means for the institution of education and organizations. Standardized tests are not really about individuals. Standardized tests are ways that you can aggregate large amounts of data across different settings and start to produce like a general sense of how well school systems are doing. So for the individual, standardized tests is an assessment of our ability to memorize some information, maybe our abilities to kind of critically think about some problem-solving tasks. But in large part, standardized tests are ways to measure entire societies. So you can think about like a local school district, a community, a particular school, maybe a particular classroom. But generally, that's not what's going on. What's going on with standardized tests is it's a way to efficiently meet the needs of institutions and organizations. So in this way, I'm trying to move you along from thinking from an individualistic point of view to a societal point of view. So when we think about world culture and it's has something to do with these isomorphic global models, like what is this? Well, one example are standardized tests. And again, like thinking about hamburgers in standardized tests, it's like, well, aren't these kind of like mundane things that well, yeah and no, but it's our lives. These are the lives that we live. I mean, if you've ever taken the BGCSEs, I can't remember which order it goes in. If you've ever taken these tests and like you can just say this, like everybody knows what these standardized tests are. Right. It's because it's a cultural norm, because it meets an institutional goal or purpose or function, because organizationally standardized tests were found to be an effective way to meet needs. Therefore, standardized tests are an isomorphic model. In terms of religion, you have also isomorphic models, and one of them is very basic. It's very basic. It's church, or it's mosque, or it's temple. It's a location where people go to congregate or engage in a congregation to experience sacred rituals and sacred practices. So religion is about separating the profane from the sacred. Like, how do we know when something is religious? Well, we know it because if you wouldn't do it in church, then it's probably something that we consider to be sacred. Like, imagine saying the F word really loudly in church. You probably wouldn't do it because we consider that to be a profane, or it's profanity. So just going to church, going to temple, going to mosque, going to a location where people congregate to separate out the sacred from the profane is an isomorphic global model. So if there are, for example, churches in the Bahamas or cathedrals, like Catholic cathedrals, you can think to yourself, were these things that were invented in the Bahamas? If the answer is no, then it's an effect of globalization. So that is a part of the institutional process of globalization. And then you have very similar practices of people in the Bahamas, as along with people in Jamaica and Ecuador and El Salvador and Nigeria and China and Brazil and Russia and the United States, because there has been the spread of an isomorphic institutional global model. The context here is religion, but we can think about the same thing in terms of education. If you can talk about going to school with somebody who lives across the planet, like think about it right now, there are people on the other side of the world in which it's nighttime, like they're fast asleep, or maybe they're up studying hard for their own standardized tests. But we have these common experiences, and the common experiences are the result of the spread of global models, which is forming a world culture. Now, there's another aspect to this, and it has to do with economics and politics. In terms of economics, the major organizational structure is the multinational corporation. And, sociologists consider this to be so important that Newman, for example, is not just going to talk about multinational corporations in chapter 9, but he talks about them in chapter 10 as well, starting on page 204. And again, I'll just point out that all of this is in your readings, okay? So for the development of global models, the development of institutional and organizational structures around the world, people basically, like in our everyday lives, we need to be motivated. There needs to be an incentive. There needs to be a reason why we're engaging what we're engaging in. And part of this has to do with the structure of economic organizations in the form of multinational corporations. So companies that operate all around the world is basically what a multinational corporation is. Some of these corporations, like Walmart, are larger than entire countries. So the last time I checked, and you can fact check me on this if you want, or maybe if we have enough time, I can just show you this. So if I look up the net profits of Walmart, the net profit of Walmart annual net income for 2024 was $15 billion, 32% increase, $13 billion. So, okay, and we're not even through all the way through 2024 yet. With fiscal year 2024 revenue of $648 billion. Now that's revenue. That's like money coming in, coming out. Walmart is a major organizational hub in the network of organizations, because think about, like, if you've ever been to a major department store, or even the mall at Marathon, we have all these different stores and they're selling different products from different companies. So these are examples of organizational networks. So like the revenue that's coming through Walmart is different from its net product or net profits. At the end of the day, Walmart's making like 13, 14, 15 billion dollars a year, which is quite a bit of money. Now, if we look at the GDP, or the gross domestic product of the Bahamas, I think it's somewhere around $2.5 billion. Last time I checked, Bahamas GDP, for 2023, $14 billion. So I was a little bit off, but it's about as close. So the Bahamas is producing. Now, this is not like net profits, but this is about like the gross, like at the end of the day, how much economic value is being produced in the Bahamas. It's about as much as the net profits of Walmart. So like Walmart is doing like $648 billion in revenue, which is quite a bit more than the entire gross domestic product of the country of the Bahamas. And now, I did look this up one time, but I'm not going to take the time to do it right now. But at one point in time, I figured out the amount of space that Walmart has, and because it has various stores, it has thousands of stores throughout the world. But it also has distribution centers. And I looked at this, and Walmart has more space that it occupies than the landmass of the Bahamas. The Bahamas is spread out across several hundred of miles of ocean, but if you just look at the landmass, Walmart is in fact larger than the Bahamas. Another thing is if how many people does Walmart employ? So I see 1.6 million, 2.1 million, 2.1 million employees. And now if we look at population of the Bahamas, it's around 400,000. Yeah, 400,000. So Walmart's employing 2 million people. The Bahamas is 400,000 people. Walmart is net profiting about as much as the entire GDP of the Bahamas. So when we think about like multinational corporations, one of the reasons why we want to spend a little bit of time on this is because there are some companies on the planet that are larger than entire countries. So obviously, if you have, somewhere like China or India, which each have more than 1 billion more people than the United States. So there are two countries each that have 1 billion more people than the United States. Yet the United States itself is one of the dominant economic, political, and military powers of the planet. Plus, we can talk about Americanization, the spread of American culture around the world that's leading to similar experiences with hamburgers, standardized tests, dominant religions. If we looked into the military bases that are spread around the world, there's a lot of influence that the United States have, though it has like fewer people than than two other countries. 1 billion fewer people than two other countries. And now think about this, like if Walmart were so powerful as a multinational corporation, why don't we see it in the Bahamas? And one of the most common rebuttals that I get to this is, well, the Bahamas just has too small of a market. And for me, I'm like, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think it's that. I think that we'd have to also look into the political pressures that are put onto corporations that don't do business in the Bahamas, because like Verizon and what are some T-Mobile and US Cellular would probably like to expand their markets out, but in the Bahamas you have access to Alive and BTC. And in my understanding of it, prior to Alive coming about, it was only BTC, and this like Bahamas telecommunications. It was like a governmental thing. So there are politics that are involved in the situation. Like I just don't buy it that the Bahamas is too small of a market. I think that there's some political pressures which involves protectionism. Now, if we did go on into the semester, I would talk about protectionism and some of these dynamics that are involved in the relationship between politics and economics. But for our time being here, I'm just emphasizing the idea that there is an organizational form called the multinational corporation that provides the function for the institution of economics. And there are many different corporations that kind of mirror each other. Like you can go into different department stores and they're all kind of looking very similar. Like Walmart and Target, and I can't even think of some of the other, like there used to be Kmart and there, Sears is out. I think J.C. Penney's out. There's various corporations that have gone bankrupt. And maybe we'll see Walmart becoming the dominant form. Maybe it'll be Amazon, or there'll be some competition there. Maybe they'll swallow each other up. One of the fears is that multinational corporations tend toward monopoly practices. Now, with that respect, we can get into like free market economic theory and why monopolies are not suitable for free market competition. Because if you really did have a free market, you would have people out there who would say like, oh, is somebody not taking advantage of this situation? Well, let me get in there and take advantage of it. And then another person would say, oh my God, are you profiting off of this? Well, I want to get in on that action. And then that's the nature of free market competition. But I digress. So world culture has a lot to do with politics, economics, religion, education, or these various domains or models or social institutions that guide most of our daily lives. Like most of our daily lives are spent in some type of institutional context in which we are voluntarily engaging with each other. So when we think about like voluntary engagement, what we're thinking about is civil society. So just like think like being civilized people. So civilians. So this idea that like, we kind of cooperate, we more or less get along with each other. Sure, there's crime that goes on, there's violence, but for the most part, like when we think about social institutions, except for politics, it's premised on the idea that human beings will just kind of naturally interact with each other in ways that are more or less cooperative or mutually beneficial, or at least not outright or explicitly violent. And if it is, then we involve the institution of governance or government or law enforcement to enact retribution, or to enact some type of protective service that prevents or dissuades or at least punishes people for engaging in violence or theft. Basically hurting people and taking their stuff. Like, if you can follow two simple rules, don't hurt people and don't take their stuff, then you can engage in civil society. Now, if you read through this section, which again is in your readings, you'll once again see that Ritzer has this predilection for Marx and Engels, who have a very different idea about civil society than Tocqueville. So there are different theories on what civil society is. And it's premised on this notion of whether or not economics is the prime mover or the prime driver of society. So Marx and Engels believe that economics drives the rest of society, that multinational corporations dominate governments, that they initiate uh, policies, and to some extent, this could be true. This could be very well true, in which you have like legalized bribery that's called lobbying, like lobbyists. That the Washington, D.C., the federal area in the United States, is the most wealthy area in the United States, primarily because so many lobbyists or companies or corporations locate firms there to try to influence government. Now, it's that idea of influence. Like, the question is how much influence does economics have over politics? And this is a big debate. So when you go through the section on civil society, this is one of the things that Ritzer is kind of teasing out is, whether or not it's government or economics that's the prime mover. You can you can read into that however much you want, whether or not you believe it's the economic or capitalist market. But one of the ideas is that we're moving into a global civil society. Like, how do you have situations across the world in which people can more or less peacefully or voluntarily cooperate with each other? Well, you would have to have networks of organizations that have some type of institutional isomorphism and shared culture. So you'd have to have a situation in which we can communicate together, which is being facilitated now through technology, where we have real-time translation, which is, I mean, this is like stuff of science fiction for most of the 20th century, was to have a real-time translator, which now on my phone, if I talk to somebody who speaks a different language than me, the artificial intelligence can translate what they're saying to me in real time, which is just mind-blowing. So we're moving into a situation in which we have the real possibility of developing a fully fledged world culture with a global civil society. This is in part the dream of the communists, is to have a global communist system in which people, share in our common good across the planet. I myself think that necessarily involves a bureaucracy that is so powerful that it can dictate to our lives beyond our control, which means that there's a certain amount of coercion or violence that would be involved in it. Like, I would prefer an actual global civil society with a voluntary world culture. Other people more or less want a series of agencies or institutions that have coercive powers that engage from globalization from above or top-down governance. And that's where we get to the idea of global governance. So the nation state is an organizational form in which societies have been organized for about 500 years now, since about the end of the 1600s, so about 300, 400, 500 years, give or take, like what society you're talking about. And the idea that we have flags and national anthems and a sense of ourselves as members who are governed by a central government is kind of new. Like, that's relatively new, considering the 10,000 or 100,000 years that humans have been on the planet, depending upon who you listen to. But global governance is more about the coercive powers of bureaucracies over our lives. And if you kind of think about how little influence you have on your nation state governmental system, the concern comes to be how much representation do we personally have in a global governance system? And really, global governance is not about the individual's lives, it's about governing nation states and multinational corporations, the two major players in terms of economics and politics. You also have militaries, but we have NATO and we have some like alliances that are forming, and you have the military industrial complex in the United States, which might be its own independent thing. That's debatable. But the global governance is really about a series of agencies and organizations that that operate alongside each other, in which nation states, alliances like NATO, so the World Trade Organization, some other organizations like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum. I would also include like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Bilderberg Group, that are these policy networks essentially that deal with economics, politics, military, and also have cultural influences. Now, the cultural influences go two ways. Uh, and I could I could spend quite a bit more time on this. I thought though that I would try to show this to you, not so much with me talking, but just want to indicate some material that I have in the course playlist for you. Now, if you scroll quite a ways down, you'll find one of my videos, a very short one. You can use it for your upcoming assignment. Neo-Marxist sociologists want global socialism. I think I made my case for that. But the idea is that empire, returning to this idea of empire, has been a motivation of civilizations and societies for a long time. It's probably one of the oldest global forces in the world, is this spread of political military will, the spread of economic interest into different geographic areas of the world, and the blurring of lines between these different institutional domains. So if you wanted to, you could scroll through the playlist and get to this area down here. But really, I think what's going on is that there are political, military, and economic forces that shape lives all around the world. And the less influence individuals have over these agencies, the better for those agencies, because then they can kind of operate without accountability, without transparency. And for a long period of time, if you talked about these types of things in any meaningful way, uh, you'd be called a conspiracy theorist. So if you want to, you can go to this part of the playlist. Right now, I'm looking for a particular video. This is a 3-minute thought from Hart and Negri. So I wanted to return to this idea, even though this isn't in your readings right now. It is a major point that Ritzer makes and something that I've talked about before, because I want to revisit this central idea. So the thesis is that there's this sort of nebulous organizational network or networks of organizations that are basically operating economics, politics, and military, influencing culture, probably for the purposes of resubstantiating the will of empire. So if you wanted to talk about some type of nefarious global force that's shaping all of our lives, this is the word that you would use. And it's legitimate. It's right there in the textbook. The idea is that it's leading to deterritorialization, or the decreasing significance where culture takes place. So like if there's a world culture that exists all across the planet, whether it's eating hamburgers, taking standardized tests, practicing religion, driving automobiles, wearing blue jeans, or like thinking about our relationship between government in particular ways, the proposal is that empire is a parasite. It's a parasite. That there's a parasite class that's feeding off the energy of the people across the planet, and that it's reducing the sovereignty of nation states along with the political sovereignty of individuals in those nation states, that have a relationship between our representatives that we elect in democratic processes with these unelected bureaucrats who are operating these institutions and organizations that seem to be trying to expand their powers, without representation. So, whether or not you believe that to be true, these people certainly believe it. Now, they are Marxists, so they want a global socialist or communist order. They believe that capitalism and free markets are a large problem. I myself don't believe that, but they do. So I figured I would let you hear from them, like what they have to say. Trying to be fair here.
By Michael Hart and Antonio Negri that was published in the year 2000. In this book, Hart and Negri attempt to describe a new form of global political order, which they call the empire. The idea of the empire follows an important transformation in international relations in the early 90s, namely the collapse of the communist Eastern Bloc. In reference to this transformation, political thinkers like Francis Fukuyama announced that the end of history is approaching. This meant that the worldwide spread of liberal democracies and free market capitalism was to be interpreted as the arrival of the end of history, of the final form of human government. To emphasize, in this political environment, every alternative to the liberal democratic state as well as free market capitalism was rendered dangerous and obsolete. Hart and Negri therefore undertake to describe a form of politics that could reform the democratic structures of the new world order, the empire. They want to answer a simple question: how is it possible to have a political reform or a transformation when there seems to be nothing coherent to rebel against? Here, Hart and Negri introduce a concept that should render global political power more coherent, namely the empire. They interpret the empire as a network of different centers of powers that are functioning together. In other words, for Hart and Negri, the contemporary global political design is not chaotic. As they themselves claim, there is world order. Hart and Negri think that the power of the dominant nation states is still very significant. However, this power should be related to the power of supranational institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the United Nations. In addition, the subnational powers such as NGOs and media outlets should also be considered as elements within the new world order, the empire. Hart and Negri think that the empire has no center. It is a network of many centers of powers all functioning together. The problem for Hart and Negri is that the empire lacks the democratic input of the people. For example, the leaders of such supranational institutions like the IMF and the World Bank are not democratically elected. Another key point is that for Hart and Negri, the empire is not merely a political form of power, it is also a biopolitical form of power. Here, Hart and Negri connect the concept of the empire with Gilles Deleuze's concept of the society of control. Hart and Negri write, "The society of control might thus be characterized by intensification and generalization of the normalizing apparatuses of disciplinarity that internally animate our common and daily practices. This control extends well outside the structured sites of social institutions through flexible and fluctuating networks." In other words, the empire defines a new world order that guides and animates even the most intimate of human practices. For Hart and Negri, empire can be transformed only when people finally arrange themselves in a creative assembly, which they call the multitude.
Okay, so one thing that was discussed in there was the New World Order. And this is something that, has been tossed around for quite a while. I'm looking through the playlist as I was showing you this, and there's a video that's missing. It's called Invisible Empire. It should be in my playlist. Order defined. Now, this is something that, like, traditionally, if you talked about it in any kind of meaningful sense, you'd be called a conspiracy theorist. But it's, you know, it's a widely known concept. I don't know why you'd be called a conspiracy theorist. I thought I would show you just, you know, a few minutes of this. I think if I click on it, what we're going to see is a little context tab. And there it is. The New World Order is used in several conspiracy theories. Now you decide for yourself whether or not your textbook is a conspiracy theory, saying that there's this nebulous organizational network of parasites who want power and domination over our lives. And then if we are entering into a new world order and it's a conspiracy theory, why do so many politicians talk about it?
Hi, my name's Jason, and I used to be just a good old average American kid living in upstate New York. There's me. I played baseball, mastered Mortal Kombat, went to the prom, said the Pledge of Allegiance every day, and loved my country. I even lived the dream of every American youth, college. Sure, it was a state school, but it also happened to be a party town. Great times all around, right? Well, sort of. I still had to work hard as a pizza guy to make it. And of course there was school. I had to figure out the computer graphics programs I was working with, as well as attend classes I didn't care about. I certainly didn't know much about geopolitics. Then 9/11 happened and everything changed. I was pissed. How dare the Muslim extremists massacre all those people? But was it all true? Prior to the invasion of Iraq, something didn't seem right. I then did a startling thing. I actually took a look at what happened that terrible September day. What I found horrified and angered me to such an extent that I took action. We were lied to, and lied to big time. Before I knew it, I went from a normal college student to the political guy at the party to one of the guys that brought you the first internet blockbuster, Loose Change. The film would not only change my life, but countless others as well.
So if you've ever seen Loose Change, the documentary about September 11th, conspiracy theorist documentary, it is riveting. Oh. Like, you watch it, and by the end, not even the end, 10 minutes in, you're like...
You got your car packed, your head...
You're just like, oh my God, it's all true.
So every place, there's questions coming from this documentary. And you don't have to believe everything in the documentary to still have questions come up. And you look back and you remember what you saw and what you were told, and now you have questions.
We got the boogeyman out there. Wow. See, for many years it was communism, then it was the war on drugs, now it's the war on terror. All through our life we've had to have a boogeyman.
Loose Change took the truth about 9/11 into the mainstream with over 100 million views and allowed me to travel the country and even take on some of my detractors.
The answer is no, they cannot. Jason, I think it's telling that every time you disagree with something, you call the people a liar. I'm not calling anybody a liar, sir. I'm calling you a liar because you are a liar.
But if we were lied to about 9/11, then who was really behind it? A lot of people on the web were pointing towards the New World Order, but that was impossible. I mean, the Hulkster couldn't be involved, could he?
The NWO is the only way to go, and what you gonna do?
So I set out to find out if a New World Order really existed. And if it did, what was it? Who was involved? And what were their goals?
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed.
Some cringe when they hear the term New World Order, despite all of these prominent people using it.
The world that maybe some people dreamt of at that conference back in Bournemouth, when it looked as if maybe history would end, that liberal democracy would triumph, that free market economics would slowly progress, and we'd have a new world order.
And together they helped to create, were the principal leaders in creating, a new world order and a winning strategy in the Cold War.
We are part of a new world order. And as the recently departed Admiral William J. Crowe once said, it's long on new and it's short on order.
Walter Isaacson wrote a wonderful book about some of the wise men who helped shape the New World Order following the Second World War.
As we devise a way forward in Iraq, I urge the international community to embrace its responsibility for creating that new world order. A new world order based upon collective action.
The transatlantic partnership was never just the foundation of our security. It was the foundation of our way of life. It was forged an experience of the most bitter and anguished kind. Out of it came a new Europe, a new world order, a new consensus as to how life should and could be lived.
And just like that, it was gone. It was a new world order. That's what President George H. Bush said. Harvard historian Francis Fukuyama pronounced the end of history.
In fact, when it is used, that person is often dismissed out of hand because of the perception that it is nothing more than a conspiracy theory. Actually, the idea of global governance and a one world order has been around for centuries.
And you can pick it up from there if you want. This video should be in my playlist. I'll point out, though, that what happened recently was an attempt by a global organization called the World Economic Forum. This is an organization that I pointed out before. And they were saying that the opportunity that the COVID pandemic provided was for a great reset, is what they called it. So I'll go ahead and play this for you so that you can see what the explicitly stated goals are of global governance organizations.
The pandemic has radically changed the world as we know it, and the actions we take today as we work to recover will define our generation.
Now is the time to think what history would say about this crisis.
2020 has been challenging on a lot of levels, as economic, environmental, and societal frailties have been laid bare. But it's also proved that when we need to, we can act rapidly and restructure our lives.
Recovery from the pandemic is an opportunity. We can see rays of hope in the form of a vaccine, but there is no vaccine for the planet. Nature needs a bailout.
You don't want to go back to the status quo that you had before simply because it was the status quo that got us here.
With everything falling apart, we can reshape the world in ways we couldn't before. Ways that better address so many of the challenges we face. And that's why so many are calling for a great reset. A great reset? That sounds more like buzzword bingo masking some nefarious plan for world domination. Hands up, this kind of slogan hasn't gone down well. But all we really want to say is that we all have an opportunity to build a better world. And it's not surprising that people who've been disenfranchised by a broken system and pushed even further by the pandemic will suspect global leaders of conspiracy. But the world's not that simple. Every one of us has differing priorities, values, and ideas. That's part of why solutions are so hard to come by, and why we all need to be involved in the decision-making. Because whether it's politicians, CEOs, academics, activists, or you, we're all about getting people together, even those you may not like, to sit down at the table and develop solutions that work for all of us. But
we need enormous trust between the private sector and the public sector for this to actually work. That trust is hard to come by.
it's time for people to work together, listen to each other, and build this trust so we can move towards a better world. And we really need one. Because while the pandemic affects us all, it's clear it affects some more than others.
The first people who are hit are the people at the front, those who are vulnerable. It is those on the front line who take it first, and that is simply unacceptable.
See, at the start of 2020, 1% of the world's population owned 44% of the wealth. And since the start of the pandemic, billionaires have increased theirs by more than 25%, whilst 150 million people fell back into extreme poverty. And with climate change set to dwarf the damage caused by the pandemic, the message from 2020 should be abundantly clear.
Capitalism, as we know it, is dead. This obsession that we have had with maximizing profits for shareholders alone has led to incredible inequality and a planetary emergency.
But no one can do this alone, and top-down approaches won't get us anywhere, because everything we've learned in our work has shown us that diverse voices lead to better results. And it's for these reasons that the forum talks about something called stakeholder capitalism, which would shift businesses away from just profit. Because
if we want to change where the focus of our recovery will go, then we need a new dashboard for the new economy. And that needs to encompass people, planet, prosperity, and institutions.
Giving people a real stake in the economy and putting well-being before growth. And that's all about getting the right people in the right place at the right time.
We must rebuild.
We'll leave it right there. Now, I don't particularly agree with the that approach, and I think it fell through as far as I've seen. Certainly with the change in the new administration and the federal government coming in, you might see pushback and challenges. Suffice it to say, there's quite a bit to say about world culture and global government. It has a lot to do with top-down and bottom-up processes, globalization from above, globalization from below. It has also a lot to do with your perspective. So, for example, in that particular video, you saw the blame it on capitalism meme, the alleged need for global governance to address global inequality, global climate change, global pandemics. You also have global economic recessions and global terrorism that have all been used to justify the expansion of what Hart and Negri would call empire that is attempting to build a new world order. So that is what I have for you. However much you want to get out of it is up to you. Whatever you want to do with your final homework assignment, final writing assignment is up to you. But you have the the reading list that from this point on, you have all the readings that I'll use for the final exam, which will be comprised of material that I've been setting in the reading guides for the last several weeks. As I've stated before, you should be looking at the titles of the chapters, the titles of the headings, the subheadings, the key or boldface concepts, and really trying to learn and understand what the material is about. Because if you're just memorizing the information, you're not actually learning it. You're just trying to memorize it for a short period of time to identify correct answers on an exam, which is a consequence of mass education and standardized testing. What I'm interested in is you actually learning the material so that hopefully you can kind of take a look at the world around you and make up your mind on what you think is going on and you know, maybe what some of the solutions might possibly be. Like I've said before, I don't necessarily agree with our textbooks. I don't agree with that video, but you know, it's not up for me to decide what you think. You need to make up your own mind. And so hopefully this semester, I've given you some tools that will help you better do that.